Outside the window, profound darkness cloaked the troubled city. Even the headlights out on the streets were masked from view. This moonless night, the stars had lost their luster. Lucien stood on the top floor of the Black Swan building, watching the dense clouds drift by on the wind. He stood alone in the narrow hallway, the cityscape reflecting darkly in his eyes. Just then, approaching footsteps could be heard. Lucien knew who it was without looking up, patiently waiting for his visitor to speak his name.
Ares.
His tone was temperate, yet carried with it an imperceptible warning. Lucien's eyes darkened, but when he turned to face his visitor, he wore a gentle expression, like that of a professor. The silver-haired man had just emerged from an important meeting. He was standing in the shadows, which afforded him some cover. Undisguised distrust and hostility filled his eyes. Overlooking this man's attitude, Lucien got straight to the point.
Did your plan succeed?
I've heard things.
The visitor did not reply, but instead changed the topic.
They're saying you took part in Special Task Force experiments.
Utter nonsense, Lucien thought. But that was all part of Lucien's plan. He laughed lightly, though the gleam of humor was absent from his eyes, and all traces of Lucien were momentarily extinguished.
It seems our collaboration has proven successful.
At that moment, the clouds parted and moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating both men. The light cut through the air like a knife, reminiscent of that night so long ago, stripping away all falsity, exposing the blood-soaked truth. Lucien was briefly transfixed. Since his departure from Black Swan, everything was going according to plan. Maybe it had all been too easy. That was why, when Lucien received news of the failed experiment, he was not particularly concerned. He sat at his desk, patiently thumbing his way through the large pile of research reports in front of him. This particular project had only been running for 12 months and had dealt with a highly theoretical aspect of reality: space-time. Black Swan had already devoted decades of research to unlocking its mysteries, but had never seen any promising results. Not long ago, Lucien had successfully made contact with the edge of reality, a revelation which propelled him to seek out and confirm the existence of the Black Cabin. But the entrance hidden behind a waterfall, the spatial abilities of the old man as described in the show Miracle Finder, and the so-called zero-dimensional space created by Black Swan were clearly not the ones he was looking for. Silence filled the laboratory, only disturbed by the delicate sounds of pages being turned. On the final page of the report, Lucien read the following. The experiment was largely a failure. We must conclude that jumping through space-time is not possible under the current conditions without the necessary evol support. A large red fail stamp had been pressed onto the page. Lucien put the report down and closed his eyes, lost in thought. He wondered if there might be other ways to locate that space and find the girl. Lucien eliminated each possibility as it occurred to him, finally concluding, there is no other way. The realization startled him, and for a moment, his natural confidence was shaken. He recalled a snippet of conversation in the lead-up to that fateful day. Who was the person in the box? Could it have been her? Lucien picked up a pen and wrote "Suspend Experiment" on the last page. He'd found many clues, many analogous occurrences, but what was false could never become true. He would have to wait a little longer. 1 month earlier, Lucien had been working night and day in a new lab, focused on the new influenza virus research. The team was making progress, not too fast, yet not too slow. This rate of progress was right under his control, but the media insisted on referring to him as a genius. At times, memories of her would flood his thoughts. Was she depending on him to avert this disaster? He was just a man, after all, not a miracle worker. Her messages would reach him by various means, without any particular effort on his part. Perhaps he had been too indulgent, allowing her to investigate on her own, and to go to that hospital with the abandoned lab. He, however, kept this information to himself, and certainly didn't share it with the organization. But when he heard she was attending the celebration, he'd almost had a heart attack. He put down the report concerning the latency of the virus and the time of the last outbreak, which happened to coincide with the start of the celebration. There was no way the timing was a coincidence. He took off his lab coat and swiftly headed out the door. Someone in the hall asked where he was going, but Lucien did not answer. He was 1 step behind, and the girl disappeared into the crowd on the square, like a drop of water, lost to the ocean. With extreme anxiety in his heart, Lucien's expression could not mask his unspeakable concern. It pierced him like the pain in his chest. A sudden noise. Turning quickly, he saw a Ferris wheel heading straight for the frail figure. Unconsciously, he used his evol, and a thin film of light appeared in front of the girl, blocking the wheel. He watched her slowly close her eyes, resigned to her fate, her face filled with despair and exhaustion. A sharp pain lanced through his heart. The sound of the chopper was deafening. Lucien stared intently at the girl. Slipping his hands into his coat pockets, he turned on his heel and stepped off the street corner. That was the last time he saw her. If he had known she was about to disappear, would he have still gone out to meet her that day? Lucien smiled faintly, his eyes distant. He knew the answer all too well. He would not have. There was a knock at the door. The assistant waited for permission before delivering the report.
The experiment was very successful. Viral transmission has been interrupted and the situation is under control. We estimate it will take 1 month from the vaccine's launch for the outbreak to be fully contained.
Lucien showed no signs of triumph. He simply nodded, signed the document, put on his jacket, and left. As he opened the door, the assistant asked,
Going out, Professor?
Lucien nodded once and smiled.
I'm off to smell the flowers.
Police tape still draped across the entrance to the abandoned quarantine zone. Dark gray buildings pushed up into the dreary sky like tombstones. The whole place was desolate and deathly quiet. For the people of the city, the zone reminded them of a dark episode, and they avoided it like the plague. Yet even in this dismal place, summer flowers bloomed brightly along the roadside. Though spring had been over long ago, summer felt exceptionally long. Time passed quickly. Summer turned to fall, and in the blink of an eye, winter had arrived. Lucien put down the documents and pressed the bridge of his nose to relieve the tension. All the late nights were affecting him. The new Ultima bioresearch facility was almost complete, but he still had a lot of work to do. Black Swan's disappearance, the special task force publishing a list of evolvers. It was as though someone had set the gears in motion, each cog influencing the next. Suddenly, the sounds of cheering came from outside, interrupting his thoughts. Lucien walked over to the window, and to his surprise, flurries of snow floated gently from the sky. He pushed open the window, and a blast of cold air rushed into the room, disturbing the papers on his desk. Winter had been very cold this year, and it seemed the snowfall had arrived early, too. He stuck out his hand and caught a snowflake in his palm, which melted quickly into a bead of water. Lucien's thoughts drifted to the snowman they built on the windowsill last year, which dissolved in a couple of hours when the weather finally warmed up. Lucien grabbed the front of his shirt. The erratic pounding of his heart was like a warning that he was thinking about her again. Another scene suddenly flashed through his mind. He had his hands around her throat, forcing her head upwards and exposing the softness of her neck. She looked weak and harmless, as if even the slightest pressure would make her faint and fall into his arms. Lucien struggled to shake the images from his mind. He looked down at his open hand and pondered its meaning. The situation had obviously never happened, but it was as if he had really been there, as if he had experienced it personally. He could still feel the frightened trembling of her throat in his hand. It made his fingers twitch. The scene did not surprise him. Indeed, it only confirmed what he had suspected all along. But he still wanted to know how it could have happened. How could he have done such a thing? It seems we need to speed up, Lucien thought to himself, shutting the window. The snow quickly obscured the world outside. Walking over to the table, he picked up the invitation. It was signed with the letter A. Suddenly, he saw himself kissing her hand and saying,
"This will be the final sacrifice."
He witnessed the heavy snowfall and ice-covered streets. Loveland City was completely cloaked in white. Unperturbed by the scenes invading his mind, Lucien steadily ripped up the invitation and threw it into the bin. He lowered his gaze, concealing the fire in his eyes. By the time Lucien left the facility, it was already very late. The snow fell all night, gathering in thick drifts that had frozen hard by early morning. The first cars on the streets were forced to plow their way through. The red and amber traffic lights reflected off Lucien's black hair. Suddenly, the rays of light began to distort as he vanished into thin air. The cab driver waiting at the light rubbed his eyes in disbelief and wondered if he was seeing things. Thousands of miles away, Lucien appeared without warning inside an empty passage, surrounded by black metal walls glowing with a cold light. Everything was just as it had appeared to the corner surveillance camera, though it appeared out of focus, as if viewed through fog. Lucien carefully sized up his surroundings. It seemed plain enough. He set out down the passageway into darkness. The moment he passed through, everything became light. Before him stood a high-tech chamber, a mechanical column rising vertically from its center. Shafts of faint light spilled through a skylight at the top of the domed roof, illuminating the Special Task Force symbol on the floor below. The great steel giant was not yet operational. It slumbered in darkness, though it had a presence that was impossible to ignore.
They ask for a lot.
Taking it all in, Lucien proceeded directly towards the central column. Ignoring the authentication screen, Lucien's pupils constricted. The light began to shift and bend as he was transported to an inner chamber. Lucien immediately spotted the human-shaped receptacle at the center and frowned. No programs were running, but Lucien could sense the definite presence of an evil. It called to the evil within him. A powerful, innate attraction that grew stronger with every step.
They have almost completed the testing phase.
Lucien turned on the control console, and after a brief moment of thought, entered a complex series of digits. He waited patiently for it to reveal its secrets. A cold gleam shone in his eyes.
One step from victory is still a defeat.
No matter how close to finished this evolution accelerator appeared, it was still a failed prototype. One of his own, in fact, with some slight modifications. It was doomed to fail from the beginning, because the gene model it required was unobtainable. Without this core, the whole device was nothing but a shell. There was a quiet hissing sound, and the metal surface of the device began to open, exposing the object concealed within. Inside the darkened interior, the core gently glowed, and a wave of pure evol energy swept over Lucien like a stream of cool water, startling him. Eyes wide with shock, his astonishment immediately transformed into barely suppressed rage. A terrible suspicion overwhelmed his thoughts, and his brain began running furious calculations. The gene model he had just formulated in his mind was the final piece of the puzzle. His failed prototype had been perfected, and it was breathtakingly brilliant. He gave a wry smile. Lucien felt a great urge to smash everything before him to pieces, but reason stayed his hand. He should have known, or perhaps he had known, and had subconsciously repressed it. His plan had been flawless, but there was one person he had never included. Lucien had not been home for a long time. Opening the door, it felt slightly unfamiliar. He had not spent a lot of time here, and there were few signs of life in the cold apartment. Any traces the girl had left in his life were also gone. Colors seen long ago had lost their vividness in his memory. Remembering to water the plants on the windowsill, Lucien spotted one that had been dead for a long time. He remembered her smile, the first time it bloomed that summer day. In the blink of an eye, winter had ended. Everywhere the snow had melted, revealing fresh greenery emerging from the ground. Spring was in full bloom, yet this plant had withered where it stood. Lucien put down the watering can. Caring for such plants required patience, a patience he no longer possessed. The moment he received his answer that day, the images from those other worlds had stopped appearing before him, as though they had been trying to convey the same message. He chuckled to himself.
What am I expecting?
If he had known that day was going to be the last time he would ever see her, would he have chosen differently? Even if the answer was yes, what was the point of discussing it now? Lucien put on his coat and headed out. 6 months had passed, and all the disasters had become but faint memories. Some people still recognized him on the street, and many would come up to thank him on occasion. Lucien would simply smile and nod graciously. The camphor tree on the hillside was unchanged. In the shade of the tree, many precious memories came flooding back to him. He placed his hand gently on its trunk and closed his eyes, as if to say goodbye. In return, the camphor tree's leaves rustled in the wind, as though it were telling him a story. Finally, he withdrew his hand from the bark. He composed himself as he turned around. Before him stood a figure, catching him completely off guard. Like a real-life phantom, a girl was standing in the shadow of the tree. She smiled at him, and he saw his own figure reflected in her bright eyes. Lucien's heart began to pound. Suddenly, he began to see colors, the green grass, the pale blue skies, and the fluffy white clouds off in the distance. Rich greens and blues sprung forth, saturating the blank canvas of winter. Surprised, he let out a chuckle. He had been right. She was always outside of his plan. But now, he didn't need to say goodbye.